Her cleverness was to say that, and it gave Lane the chance to say, oh, well, clearly these BBC people have overstepped themselves.
Mycock's case was highlighted in a BBC television programme, Rough Justice, shown in October. Today, Lord Lane said the programme had used outrageous methods in what he called investigation by menaces.
Lord Lane used the bulk of his summing up not to discuss the wrongful conviction of Mycock, but to attack the BBC journalists.
In his judgment, Lord Lane was highly critical of the pressure which he said the Rough Justice team had put on Anne Fitzpatrick.
What came to a head there was the utter white-hot anger and frustration of the higher judiciary, in particular Lord Lane. Lord Lane had grown up in this cloister, as so many of them do, of the criminal justice system, and he'd reached the peak of it, and it was his life, and he cherished it. And like so many people in the law, you think you've actually perfected a system, especially the British system. And then these twerps from the telly come in, who aren't even lawyers, and start poking their finger in it.
He had it in for broadcasters, Rough Justice and the BBC, and was determined to extract his pound of flesh from the production team and the BBC, which he duly did.
The Lord Chief Justice had turned the spotlight on the Rough Justice team and their methods.
We asked her a lot of questions, and we put the evidence that we'd got in front of her from her flatmates and so on, yes, of course. But the idea that we would try and get an interview by duress is daft. Of course we wouldn't.
The only thing we did with Anne Fitzpatrick that you might in any way classify that was make her understand that we were serious about this, that we were here, we were going to stay here, we wanted an interview with her because it was her right of reply, but we had a lot of evidence in Manchester that she watched of what she'd done, that an innocent man was in jail because of what she'd said and done.
Hill and Young now found themselves in the place all journalists dread. They themselves had become the story.
The newspapers concentrated more on the criticism of the Rough Justice team than they did on the fact that Mr. Mycock had been released. And a great deal of play was made in several papers about the, quotes, bad behaviour, close quotes, of the team when they visited Miss Fitzpatrick in California.
Even some Liberal commentators questioned their actions.
Confessions made under threats are never reliable. They're not worth the videotape that they're carried on. These two researchers had done so much to build up its reputation, which is now partly destroyed as a result of their going over the line.
In Parliament, the Prime Minister herself criticised the BBC over the programme.
The Thatcher government certainly wasn't going to spurn this opportunity of being able to put the boot in on the BBC all over again. This just fitted into a sequence of events which actually represented a clash between investigative journalism and the establishment.
The timing could not have been worse. Just months earlier, the BBC had been censored by the government over a documentary featuring controversial footage of leaders from both sides of the political divide in Northern Ireland. The programme's interview with Sinn Féin's Martin McGuinness in particular was accused of being sympathetic to alleged terrorists.
I think Rough Justice runs into problems partly because the BBC is running into problems every which way and what way. And one of the very interesting things about the Mycock case is that the BBC ends up in the courts. Well, the BBC's in the courts about everything.
Locked in battle with the government, the BBC could ill afford to take on the Lord Chief Justice as well. Its top executives found that Hill and Young were in breach of journalistic guidelines.
As in many organisations, they had to do something, and that something was to discipline both Peter Hill and Martin Young. The punishment was that they would never work on investigative programmes again.
The methods used by the journalists were criticised in the appeal court, and following an internal inquiry, the BBC is suspending the journalists Martin Young and Peter Hill.
The BBC should have said, we stand by our story. We had the evidence on film, and they didn't stand by us.
I think it was a particularly shoddy way, particularly the way Peter Hill was treated. He brought this idea to the BBC. There are few enough people who care about miscarriages of justice, God knows. And to get rid of that particular aspect of Peter Hill's work, I thought was deplorable and craven. And as someone said to me, you can always rely on the BBC to let you down in these circumstances.
Hill and Young weren't the only casualties of this cycle of conflict between broadcasters and government. 12 months later, Special Branch raided the offices of a BBC team investigating a secret military spy satellite. The government took Director General Alastair Milne's scalp over the affair.
For the first time in 40 years, a Director General of the BBC has resigned his post. Alastair Milne left the corporation at lunchtime today. Personal reasons were given for his departure, but tonight there's speculation at Westminster that he was asked to leave.
The fall of Alastair Milne signalled a political blow to investigative journalism. It symbolised the end of one era of British television and the start of another. With the arrival of satellite television and a proliferation of channels, the BBC's focus increasingly became competition with other broadcasters. The era of almost constant tension with government was slipping away. Surprisingly, Rough Justice survived, still able to point to strong viewing figures and successes in the appeal court. A new team filled the boots of Hill and Young.
Most murders are family affairs, and for the police, most family murders are fairly simple affairs. Everything changed. It was a completely new team. I came in, a new producer came in, John Smithson. None of us had really done anything like this before.
This was a different production, its confidence shaken.
We knew that there was an unhappy Lord Chief Justice. We knew that there was a government and a Prime Minister that were prepared to be belligerent. So I was aware when I took the job that I would be walking on eggshells. I knew that sort of 2 strikes and we were out.
Those head wounds would have bled profusely. When we went back to the pathologist who conducted the post-mortem, he estimated a blood loss of about half a pint.
In came a new studio-based visual style, but the goal of producing new evidence to quash unsafe convictions remained the same.
Rough Justice has analysed that confession line by line. In many respects, it's an unsatisfactory document which told the police nothing they couldn't have known already. With the new evidence we've uncovered, much of it now seems barely credible.
I got the impression that maybe lots of people, not within journalism, but with other side of the fence, as it were, would have been happy for us to make a mistake, because that would have been the stick with which we could have been beaten. And that would have been the thing that would have caused the BBC to have taken Rough Justice off the air. So I was proud, probably above all, just of keeping miscarriages of justice very much alive.
Rough Justice did more than just keep the issue alive. It had set a ball rolling which was about to bring the problem of miscarriages to unprecedented public attention. In 1975, 2 groups of people had been imprisoned for IRA bombings of pubs. But the Guildford 4 and the Birmingham 6 insisted they were innocent, and campaigns to secure their release were formed. As the 1980s came to a close, the clamour to clear them had reached fever pitch.
Rough Justice paved the way for the opening of minds in relation to considering that the convictions of the Irish cases, the Birmingham 6, the Guildford 4, could possibly be miscarriages of justice in the public mind.
Yet Rough Justice itself did not take up either of these Irish cases.
I think if there was one strategic error, it was not taking head-on the Irish cases.
Rough Justice wanted to concentrate, in a sense, on the little cases that they knew otherwise would stand no chance whatever of publicity. So therefore, at the very moment when it should have been central to the debate, it was actually peripheral to it.
Other television programmes covered the stories.
Granada had, as it were, bagged the Birmingham 6. Yorkshire had, as it were, bagged the Guildford 4. And you know, there's no point in 2 different teams doing the same thing.
In 1989, the Guildford Four were released on appeal.
The Guildford Four go free and British justice goes on trial.
The Birmingham Six followed in 1991.
The judiciary reacted to those cases with grave concern. There have been many changes since, both judge-led and statutory, to reflect the lessons learned. To take one fundamental example, the prosecution's duty of disclosure, which, in short, requires it to disclose to the defence any otherwise unused material which it has in its possession which might undermine its own case or assist the defence case, lies at the heart of a fair trial, and it had not been complied with in those cases. Therefore, the judiciary sought to further delineate the duty of disclosure and to enforce compliance with it.
In a 2-year period, a total of 37 out of 38 convictions brought to the Court of Appeal were quashed. But Rough Justice, the programme that in a way started all this, had to watch from the sidelines. In 1992, it was reduced to just one programme a year.
You're working on several different cases at the same time. And if you're told that you can only do one of these cases, you begin to ask yourself, well, what do I do with all this evidence that I have that points to the possible innocence of someone who's in prison at the moment? Do we keep them in prison for another year until it suits the convenience of the controller of BBC One?
Jessel and virtually his entire team left the BBC for Channel 4.
We wanted to take a general legal series to Channel 4 and see if they would entertain that. And we were told, no, well, Michael Grade's not interested in that. Tell you what Michael Grade is interested in. Michael Grade would love Rough Justice.
The Channel 4 series would be called Trial and Error, and would be Rough Justice in all but name. Back at the BBC, yet another new team took over at Rough Justice.
From the day they returned home to Sheffield, the Druids have justified their silence about the murder with their so-called Code of Honour. The code is intended to stop club members from grassing on each other. But how much honour is there in a code when it's used to keep an innocent man locked up?
To fit in more with the changing television landscape, the programme became glossier, with more of the money going on screen. The simple drawings were gone. Actors now recreated the crimes.
And they play hard.
Towards the end of the 90s, the series turned its attention to a case known as the M25-3.
On Thursday, 15th December 1988, a series of terrifying crimes took place along the Surrey stretch of the newly built M25. By the end of the night, 7 people had been brutally attacked and 1 was dead.
The police were under a lot of pressure to arrest this particular gang who they claimed were responsible for this spate of robberies. And so I was charged with what was described as the M25-3 killing spree. I was convicted of murder and 3 counts of robbery and was sentenced to life with a recommendation of 50-something years.
Raphael Rowe had already spent 10 years in prison when the Rough Justice film examining his case aired in 1998. The programme publicised new evidence which demonstrated that a key witness was a police informer who had been paid for his evidence against Rowe.
3 days after the murder, he went to see a police officer contact. He gave him the names of Rowe and Davis.
I gave the police the guys' names and addresses. That's never been publicised, though. That was the actual informant. But I should return to it again. So he said, you're willing to give a statement. Because I did hear on the radio that it was a £25,000 reward.
This recording demonstrated the unreliability of the key witness statement.